Case 1, Carri Williams. May 11, 2011. Skagit County Superior Court. There are cases that leave investigators changed. Cases that make seasoned detectives sit in their cars after a long shift and ask questions they cannot answer. The case of Carri Williams is one of those cases. It is a story about a child who crossed an ocean searching for safety, a child who found the opposite of everything she was promised, and a legal reckoning that took years to fully deliver. It is a story that the community of Sedro-Woolley, Washington will never forget, and one that the child welfare system in this country has studied ever since. Her name was Hannah Grace Rose Williams. She was born in Ethiopia, and in the early years of her life, she knew hardship the way many children in under-resourced regions of the world know it, through scarcity, through uncertainty, through the kind of childhood that leaves marks no one can see. But Hannah was resilient. By every account from those who encountered her before her adoption, she was bright, curious, and full of life. She had survived conditions that would have broken many adults, and she carried herself with a quiet dignity that people noticed. When Carri and Larry Williams arrived as adoptive parents, Hannah was approximately 9 years old. The couple already had several biological children, and they had presented themselves to the adoption system as a devout, stable, and loving household. They lived in Skagit County, in the small town of Sedro-Woolley, Washington, a quiet community nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, the kind of place where neighbors know each other and trust runs deep. On paper, the Williams home appeared to offer Hannah exactly what she needed: a family, a community, and a future. What was happening behind closed doors was the complete opposite. From the moment Hannah arrived in the Williams household, investigators would later determine, she was subjected to a systematic pattern of deprivation and harm that escalated over years without any meaningful intervention from the outside world. The details that emerged during trial proceedings and in the investigative record are deeply troubling, not because they are sensational, but because they are so deliberate. What happened to Hannah Grace Rose Williams was not the result of a single moment of lost control. It was a sustained campaign, carried out over years, in a home where other children lived, in a town where people could have seen the signs. Carri Williams, investigators determined, was the primary architect of what Hannah experienced inside that home. While her husband Larry played his own role, a role the court would address separately, it was Carri who set the conditions of Hannah's daily existence. And those conditions were, by every legal and human standard, a profound violation of the child's most basic rights. Hannah was not permitted to sleep inside the family home. She was directed to sleep in an outbuilding on the property, a structure that provided minimal shelter from the Pacific Northwest weather, a region known for its damp cold, its relentless rain, and its bone-chilling winters. While her adoptive siblings slept in warm beds inside a heated house, Hannah slept apart from the family in conditions that no child should be forced to endure. She was not fed the way her siblings were fed. Investigators found evidence that Hannah was given food that was not properly prepared, food that was frozen, food that was withheld, while the other children in the household ate normally. The medical evidence gathered in the aftermath of her passing confirmed what investigators suspected. Hannah had been in a state of severe nutritional deprivation for an extended period of time. Her body, at the time she lost her life, told the story that her voice had never been allowed to tell. She was also denied the ordinary dignities that most people take entirely for granted. She was directed to use an outdoor portable toilet rather than the facilities inside the family home. She was isolated from the other children. She was prevented from participating in normal family life. Every dimension of her daily existence, where she slept, what she ate, how she moved through the world, was controlled and diminished. Neighbors and community members would later reflect on moments that, in hindsight, carried the weight of warnings they did not know how to read. There had been glimpses of a child who seemed disconnected, withdrawn, different from the other children in the household. But in a community built on trust and privacy, in a household that presented a carefully managed face to the outside world, no alarm was raised loudly enough or early enough to reach Hannah in time. On the night of May 10, 2011, moving into the early hours of May 11th, the last chapter of Hannah's life unfolded in the backyard of the Williams property. It was a wet, cold Pacific Northwest spring night, the kind of night that settles into your bones if you are not dressed for it, The kind of night that becomes dangerous if you have no shelter from it. Hannah, 13 years old and already severely weakened by years of deprivation, was outside in that rain. She was not brought inside. She was not given warmth. She was left in conditions that her already fragile body could not withstand. When emergency responders arrived at the Williams property, Hannah Grace Rose Williams had lost her life. She was 13 years old. The medical examination that followed confirmed what the scene had already suggested. Hannah had not simply become ill. She had been failed, systematically, deliberately, and over a long period of time. The findings included evidence of severe malnutrition and the effects of prolonged exposure to the elements. Her body had endured far more than any child should ever be asked to bear. The investigation that followed was extensive. Detectives from the Skagit County Sheriff's Office worked alongside child welfare investigators to reconstruct the full picture of what had happened inside the Williams home. What they assembled was a case that ultimately went before a jury in Skagit County Superior Court. A case that would last weeks, feature testimony from multiple witnesses, and result in a verdict that sent a clear message about accountability. Carri Williams was convicted of homicide by abuse, one of the most serious charges available under Washington state law for the harm of a child. The conviction reflected the jury's conclusion that what had happened to Hannah was not an accident, not a failure of judgment in a single moment, but a sustained pattern of conduct that caused her death. It was a verdict that child advocates called long overdue and deeply necessary. At sentencing, Carri Williams received 37 years in Washington State Prison. It was a sentence that acknowledged the gravity of what Hannah had endured and the length of time over which she had endured it. Larry Williams was separately tried and also convicted, receiving a substantial sentence of his own. In the years since the verdict, the case of Hannah Grace Rose Williams has become part of a broader national conversation about adoption oversight, child welfare monitoring, and the gaps that can exist between what a home looks like from the outside and what a child experiences inside it. Advocacy organizations have cited her case when calling for stronger follow-up protocols for internationally adopted children, more robust training for community members on recognizing signs of child abuse, and greater accountability for adoptive parents who violate the profound trust that adoption places in their hands. Hannah Grace Rose Williams deserved safety. She deserved warmth. She deserved a family that honored the promise they made when they brought her across an ocean. She deserved to grow up. The justice system delivered accountability. But the deeper work, ensuring that no child in a similar situation goes unseen, unheard, and unprotected, continues. If you are concerned about a child's welfare in your community, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, at 1-800-422-4453. A single phone call can change a child's life. If this case moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every subscriber helps this channel continue bringing these important stories to light. Case 2, Samara Spann. December 31st, 2004 through January 1st, 2005. King County Superior Court. There are crimes that defy easy explanation. Crimes that force investigators, prosecutors, mental health professionals, and communities to sit with deeply uncomfortable questions about the line between illness and accountability, between tragedy and deliberate action. The case of Samara Spann is one of those cases. It unfolded in the White Center neighborhood on the southwestern edge of Seattle, Washington, a community that had seen hardship before, but had never seen anything quite like what happened inside one particular home as the calendar turned from 2004 to 2005. Her name was Samara Spann. She was 6 years old. By every account from those who knew her, she was a bright and lively child, the kind of little girl who fills a room with energy, who asks questions faster than adults can answer them, who makes the people around her smile without even trying. She was at an age where the world is still mostly wonder, where every day brings something new to discover, where the future stretches out endlessly and full of possibility. Kaima lived with her mother, Samara Spann, who was 30 years old at the time of these events. The family resided in White Center, a neighborhood that sits just outside the formal city limits of Seattle, but is deeply woven into the fabric of the broader Seattle community. A neighborhood with a strong working-class identity, a diverse population, and the kind of tight-knit street life that means people know their neighbors' children, know when something feels wrong. Samara Spann had been struggling. Witnesses and investigators would later describe a woman who had become increasingly consumed by a set of deeply distorted beliefs, a framework through which she had come to view her own daughter not as a child in need of love and protection, but as something threatening, something dangerous, something that needed to be dealt with. The beliefs Spann held were not grounded in reality. Mental health professionals who reviewed the case would note the presence of severe psychological disturbance, a break from rational thinking so profound that it had reordered her entire perception of her child. But the legal question that would ultimately face King County Superior Court was not solely about the state of Samara Spann's mind. It was also about what she chose to do, and what she chose to do was irreversible. On the night of December 31st, 2004, New Year's Eve, a night when the rest of the city was gathering with family and friends, counting down to a new year full of hope, Samara Spann made a series of deliberate choices that ended her daughter's life. The specifics of what occurred inside that White Center home are among the most disturbing details in the history of Seattle's criminal court record. This documentary will convey the full weight of what happened without amplifying the graphic dimensions of the harm, because the gravity of this case does not require sensationalism. The facts alone are devastating enough. Spann took her daughter's life inside the family home. She had, in the days prior, acquired several items that investigators would later identify as premeditated preparations. Those items included a chain, a padlock, and an axe. Their purpose, as the evidence would make clear, was not incidental. They were part of a plan. What Spann did to Kaima that night went beyond causing her daughter's death. She subjected the child's body to further harm afterward, harm that investigators and prosecutors described in court proceedings with the kind of measured, careful language that the justice system uses when the facts are almost too difficult to put into words. She then placed what remained of her daughter inside a plastic storage container and transported it to the First Avenue South Bridge, where she dropped it into the water below. Kaima Spann's remains were never recovered. Let that land for a moment. A 6-year-old child. A little girl who had done nothing wrong, who had no understanding of the storm building inside her mother's mind, who deserved every protection the world could offer. Her remains have never been found. Her family has never had a grave to visit, a place to bring flowers, a location where they can sit and feel close to her. Kaima Spann exists in the records of King County Superior Court, in the memories of those who loved her, and in the conscience of a city that failed to see the warning signs in time. The investigation that followed Kaima's disappearance moved quickly once Samara Spann came to the attention of Seattle Police Department detectives. The evidence was substantial. The premeditation was clear. The items purchased beforehand told a story that no defense could fully reframe. Prosecutors in King County built a case that left little room for alternative interpretation. Samara Spann was charged with first-degree murder. She was tried in King County Superior Court. The jury, after reviewing the evidence, returned a conviction. In 2005, Samara Spann was sentenced to 23 years in Washington State Prison. The sentencing was met with grief by those who had known Kaima. 23 years felt, to many in the community, like an inadequate measure for the permanent absence of a 6-year-old child. Victim advocates and family members spoke at the sentencing hearing about the hole that Kaima's absence had left, not just in their immediate circle, but in the broader fabric of White Center, a neighborhood that had watched one of its youngest members disappear without any possibility of a proper farewell. The case raised profound questions that extend far beyond the courtroom. Questions about how communities identify and respond to mental health crises before they become tragedies. Questions about what resources were or were not available to Samara Spann in the period before December 31st, 2004, and whether different interventions could have produced a different outcome. Questions about the systems that are supposed to protect children from harm that originates inside their own homes. Mental health professionals who have studied cases like Samara Spann's have consistently argued that early intervention, when a parent shows signs of a severe break from reality, is not just a compassionate choice, but a child safety imperative. The most effective protections for children are often the ones that happen before a crisis reaches its irreversible point. Kaima Spann never got that protection. She was 6 years old, and she deserved the world. Samara Spann's conviction stands as a record of accountability. Accountability that cannot undo the loss, but that affirms, in the formal language of the law, that what happened to Kaima Spann was not acceptable, was not overlooked, and was not forgotten. Kaima deserved to grow up. She deserved to celebrate New Year's Eve as a child, with noise and color and the joy of staying up past her bedtime. She deserved all of it. The justice system gave her what it could. The rest belongs to memory, to advocacy, and to the ongoing work of ensuring that no other child is failed the way she was. If this story has stayed with you, if you find yourself thinking about Kaima, please share this video. And take a moment to like and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support keeps these stories alive. Case 3. Alyia Iverson. December 4th through 5th, 2012. Pierce County Superior Court. Some of the most heartbreaking cases in the true crime documentary record are not the ones defined by malice. They are the ones defined by neglect, by a parent who was present in the physical sense but absent in every way that mattered, by choices made in the wrong direction, one after another, until a child who could not protect himself paid the ultimate price. The case of Alyia Iverson, which unfolded in Spann, Washington, in the early days of December 2012, is exactly that kind of case. It is a case about a 2-year-old boy named Nathan, about the night that should have saved him, and about the choices that sealed his fate instead. Nathan was 2 years old. 2 years old is a particular kind of age, old enough to be curious about everything, old enough to explore any environment he finds himself in without any understanding of what is dangerous and what is safe. 2-year-olds are defined by their reach. They touch things, taste things, climb things, investigate things. They are completely dependent on the adults in their lives to make their environment safe, to be the judgment they have not yet developed for themselves. On the night of December 4th, 2012, Nathan was in a home that was not safe. His mother, Alyia Iverson, was hosting a gathering at the Spann residence, a gathering that investigators would later characterize as drug-involved. The home, on that particular night, was not a safe environment for a toddler. Drug paraphernalia was present and accessible. The supervision that Nathan required and deserved was not provided. At some point during the night, Nathan encountered a smoking pipe that contained water contaminated with methamphetamine. The pipe was within his reach. In the way that 2-year-olds interact with their environment, without any understanding of what they are touching or what the consequences might be, Nathan ingested the contaminated contents. The effects on a 2-year-old body of methamphetamine ingestion at that level are swift and severe. Nathan became visibly distressed. His body responded to the toxic substance the way any child's body would, with symptoms that were impossible to miss, impossible to misinterpret, and that any reasonable adult would immediately recognize as a medical emergency requiring urgent intervention. Alyia Iverson recognized that something had happened. The evidence gathered by investigators made clear that she was aware, in that moment, that Nathan had been exposed to the contaminated pipe. She did not call emergency services. What she did instead, and this is the detail that has stayed with investigators, prosecutors, and those who followed this case ever since, was wrap her convulsing toddler tightly in a blanket, place him in his sleeping space, and leave him there alone. She then turned her attention to cleaning up the drug paraphernalia in her room. The choice she made in that moment, the choice to prioritize concealing evidence over saving her child's life, is the choice that this case will forever be defined by. Nathan was left alone, in distress, for hours. By the time paramedics arrived at the Spann home, Nathan had lost his life. The medical findings were consistent with the effects of lethal methamphetamine poisoning. He was 2 years old. The medical examiners noted evidence of severe rigor mortis, an indication of how long the child had been without intervention. His jaw was locked. He had been dead for some time before anyone called for help. The investigation by Pierce County authorities was thorough and careful. Detectives reconstructed the timeline of the night, the gathering, the drug activity, the moment of ingestion, and Iverson's deliberate choice not to seek help. Witnesses from the gathering provided accounts of what they had seen and heard. The physical evidence corroborated the narrative that investigators had assembled. Alyia Iverson was charged in Pierce County with crimes related to Nathan's death. The case made its way through the Pierce County Superior Court system over the years that followed, years during which Nathan's family waited for accountability, waited for the legal system to affirm that Nathan's life had mattered, that the choices made on that December night had consequences. In 2016, 4 years after Nathan lost his life, Alyia Iverson was sentenced to 6.5 years in prison following her conviction for first-degree manslaughter. The sentence reflected the court's finding that her failure to act, her deliberate choice to walk away from a dying child, constituted a criminal level of negligence. 6.5 years for the life of a 2-year-old boy. For many in the community, for child advocates and family members who had followed the case through the long years of the legal process, the sentence was a complicated thing to sit with. The law had spoken. Accountability had been delivered. But the math of it, the weight of what had been lost measured against the years that would be served, was painful. The case of Nathan and Alyia Iverson became part of a broader conversation in Washington state about drug-endangered children, a population that child welfare researchers and law enforcement professionals have identified as among the most vulnerable and the most difficult to protect. Children in homes where drug activity is occurring are at elevated risk, not just from exposure to substances, but from the diminished capacity of caregivers to respond in moments of crisis. When a caregiver's judgment is compromised, a child's safety is compromised. Nathan deserved a different night. He deserved a home where the adults responsible for him were present, alert, and ready to act. He deserved the emergency responders who could have saved him, who would have saved him, if they had been called when they should have been called. He was 2 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. Accountability was delivered. The work of ensuring that drug-endangered children are identified and protected before crisis strikes. That work continues, and it requires all of us. If you care about the safety of children in vulnerable situations, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available around the clock at 1-800-422-4453. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every case we cover is a commitment to keeping these children's stories alive. Case 4, Svetlana Laurel. December 18, 2018. King County Superior Court. There are cases that begin with one kind of crime and end with an entirely different one. Cases where events escalate so rapidly, so catastrophically, that the original act is almost eclipsed by what follows. The case of Svetlana Laurel is exactly that kind of case. It is a case that began inside the bitterness of a custody dispute and ended with the loss of a 14-year-old girl who had done nothing more wrong than love both of her parents and pick up the phone to call for help. It unfolded in Renton, Washington, a city in King County, southeast of Seattle, on December 18, 2018. Her name was Garcia. She was 14 years old, an age that sits right at the edge of everything. Old enough to understand the adult world beginning to take shape around her, young enough to still trust that calling for help would make things better. Natalie was caught in the middle of something that no child should ever be placed in. The wreckage of her parents' relationship, the collateral damage of a custody battle that had turned corrosive, the slow-building pressure of a household increasingly defined by conflict rather than stability. Her mother was Svetlana Laurel. The custody dispute between Laurel and her former husband had been ongoing, grinding, and bitter, the kind of prolonged legal conflict that leaves everyone involved exhausted and raw, that distorts perspectives and erodes the emotional guardrails that ordinarily keep people from crossing lines they cannot uncross. On the morning of December 18th, Svetlana Laurel went to the Renton home of her former husband. She did not go there to talk. She arrived with a purpose that investigators would later describe as premeditated and deliberate. She brought with her a taser, and she used it. Her former husband was incapacitated and bound inside his own home before their children were due to arrive. What Laurel intended to happen next is a matter that was examined at length during the legal proceedings that followed. What actually happened next was something that no scenario, however dark, had fully anticipated. Garcia arrived at the home. She walked in to find her father incapacitated and restrained. A scene that no 14-year-old should ever have to process. A scene that would have been terrifying for anyone to encounter, let alone a child. Natalie did what a 14-year-old with a good instinct for right and wrong would do. She called 911. The emergency dispatcher who received that call heard everything that followed. The court record preserves what the dispatcher heard, Svetlana Laurel's voice, directed at her own daughter, acknowledging that Natalie had made the call. What came next was a threat so specific, so immediate, that the dispatcher could do nothing but listen as the worst unfolded on the other end of the line. Garcia was shot by her own mother while she was still on the phone with emergency services. The dispatcher who took that call, who was a professional trained for crisis, who had heard difficult things before, carried the weight of that call for years afterward. Natalie did not survive. She was 14 years old. She had done everything right. She had called for help, and she lost her life for it. The aftermath of that morning in Renton sent shockwaves through King County. Law enforcement responded to the scene. Svetlana Laurel was taken into custody. The facts of the case, the taser, the restraints, the 911 call, the dispatcher's audio recording, assembled themselves into an evidentiary picture that left very little room for interpretation. What followed, however, was years of legal delays. The case made its way through the King County Superior Court system slowly, too slowly, in the eyes of many who loved Natalie and who had been waiting for accountability. Legal motions, continuances, and procedural developments stretched the process over years that felt endless to those who were grieving. The accountability finally came. After years of waiting, Svetlana Laurel entered a guilty plea. In May of 2025, more than 6 years after Natalie was taken from her family, Laurel was sentenced to 32.5 years in Washington State Prison. For Natalie's father, for the family members who had spent years navigating both grief and the legal system, the sentencing was a moment of complicated reckoning. Justice, when it arrives after 6 years, does not feel the way people imagine justice feels. It does not fill the absence. It does not replay the years that passed while the case moved through the courts. It does not give back a 14-year-old girl who picked up the phone to do the right thing. But it matters. It matters because it is the formal declaration by the state of Washington that what Svetlana Laurel did to her daughter, to a child who was on the line with a 911 dispatcher, who was calling for help, who was trying to protect her father, was a crime of the gravest magnitude. It matters because accountability, even when it arrives late, is still accountability. Natalie Galizia deserved to grow up. She deserved to finish high school, to figure out who she was going to be, to one day tell the story of that terrifying morning and what she had survived. She deserved a future. The 32.5-year sentence is a measure of how seriously the court took the destruction of that future. It is not enough. Nothing could be enough, but it is a statement. And in the language of the law, statements matter. Rest in peace, Natalie. You did everything right. If this case has moved you, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. The stories we tell here exist because the victims deserve to be remembered. Case 5, Sandy Fernandez. Late July 2022 through August 1st, 2022. King County Superior Court. There are cases in the true crime documentary record that force viewers to confront something deeply uncomfortable. The reality that vulnerability and danger can share the same space. The case of Sandy Fernandez, which unfolded inside a motel room in Kent, Washington, in the final days of July 2022, is a case about a 2-year-old child named Jose Fernandez, about the night that should have been ordinary, and about the confession that left investigators with no ambiguity about what had happened or why. Jose Fernandez was 2 years old. He was at that particular age of childhood where everything is discovery, where the world is enormous and endlessly interesting, where sleep feels like an interruption from all there is to explore. 2-year-olds resist sleep. They push back against bedtime because they are not yet equipped to understand why sleep matters, why their bodies need it, why the adults who love them insist on it. It is one of the most universal and ordinary features of early childhood, and it requires from parents a particular kind of patience, a calm, steady presence that meets a tired, overwhelmed toddler with gentleness rather than frustration. On the night in question, Jose was in a motel room in Kent with his mother, 19-year-old Sandy Fernandez. He would not go to sleep. What followed, what Sandy Fernandez herself described in a direct confession to Kent police detectives, was a response to that ordinary childhood behavior that escalated far beyond any recognizable boundary of parental frustration. Fernandez, in her own words to investigators, admitted to striking the child multiple times. She admitted to impulses toward further harm that she did not fully restrain. She was 19 years old, alone with a toddler in a motel room, and what she chose to do in that moment changed everything. Jose Fernandez was taken to a medical facility. The injuries discovered by the medical team who examined him were extensive. The medical examination that followed Jose's passing, which occurred on August 1st, 2022, documented what the physical evidence made plain. Jose had sustained a fractured skull, a fractured jaw, and severe internal trauma consistent with the kind of force that no child's body is built to withstand. The internal abdominal injuries he suffered had produced an infection and hemorrhaging that, in combination with the other trauma he had sustained, proved unsurvivable. He was 2 years old. The confession that Fernandez gave to Kent police was, by investigative standards, extraordinary in its candor. She described what she had done in terms that left no interpretive gap. Investigators did not have to reconstruct what had happened through physical evidence alone. They had the perpetrator's own account. And that account was, in the words of the detectives who recorded it, among the most disturbing confessions they had encountered in their careers. Sandy Fernandez was charged with second-degree murder in King County. She entered a plea of not guilty in August of 2022. The legal proceedings that followed moved through the King County Superior Court system. The case of Jose Fernandez raised important and difficult questions about the support systems available to young, isolated parents, particularly those who find themselves alone with a toddler in circumstances of stress and instability. 19 years old. A motel room. No support network visible in the record. These are not factors that diminish accountability. They do not, and they should not. But they are factors that child welfare professionals and social service advocates point to when they argue that preventing tragedies like Jose's death requires more than prosecuting the people who caused them. It requires building the kinds of support structures that reach parents before they reach a breaking point. That conversation does not erase what happened to Jose. Nothing erases what happened to Jose. He was 2 years old, and he did not survive a night that should have been completely ordinary. His only role in what happened was being a toddler who would not go to sleep, the most normal thing in the world. The King County legal system has been tasked with delivering the accountability that Jose deserves. The community of Kent, and the broader community of families who heard this story and held their own children a little tighter afterward, carries the reminder of what this case represents, that the most vulnerable people in any household are often the ones who have no ability to call for help themselves. Jose Fernandez deserved gentleness. He deserved patience. He deserved to wake up the next morning and spend another day being 2 years old, curious and loud and full of life. The justice system has been asked to speak on his behalf. And however that process concludes, the record of what happened inside that Kent motel room, and the confession that preserved it, will ensure that Jose Fernandez is not forgotten. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Jose's story, like every story on this channel, deserves to be heard. Case 6. Mandie Miller. Prolonged abuse leading to September 10, 2022. Spokane County Superior Court. There are crimes that investigators describe as among the most difficult cases they have ever worked. Not because the evidence is unclear, but because the evidence is so clear, so thorough, and so deeply disturbing that the process of assembling it takes a toll on everyone involved. The case of Mandie Miller and Alexander Kramoyrov, which unfolded over months of sustained harm inside a home in Airway Heights, Washington, a community within Spokane County, is one of those cases. It is the story of an 8-year-old girl named Mila Rose Miller, and of a household that became the last place any child should ever have been. Mila Rose Miller was 8 years old. She had been adopted by Mandie Miller, a woman who was also Mila's biological aunt, a fact that makes the relationship between them both more intimate and, in light of what the evidence would reveal, more devastating. Mila was not a stranger placed in Mandie's care by a system that had no personal connection to the family. She was a child with blood ties to the woman who had taken legal responsibility for her well-being, a child who, by every reasonable expectation, should have been among the most protected people in that household. The reality inside the Airway Heights home was something entirely different. Investigators, working from evidence gathered after Mila's death and during the subsequent investigation, assembled a picture of months of sustained deprivation and harm that is, by any measure, among the most severe cases of child abuse prosecuted in Washington state in recent years. What Mila endured inside that home, at the hands of both Mandie Miller and her boyfriend, Alexander Kramoyrov, went far beyond a single incident or a pattern of episodic harm. It was systematic. It was sustained. And it escalated over time until the child's body could no longer withstand it. Mila was subjected to restraint, bound to a car seat for extended periods in a manner that investigators described as a method of control and punishment rather than any legitimate form of child management. She was deprived of food. The medical evidence gathered after her passing was staggering. Mila Rose Miller, at the time she lost her life on September 10, 2022, weighed just 26 pounds. 8 years old. 26 pounds. The medical examiners who examined that finding had to pause and let it register. An 8-year-old child in a household with food available, in a household where the adults were eating, had been denied nourishment to the point of extreme medical crisis. She had also been subjected to deliberate physical harm. Investigators found evidence that Mila had sustained injuries to her feet and toes that were consistent with being struck with a hammer, a detail that, when it emerged in court proceedings and news coverage, stopped people cold. A hammer, used against the feet of an 8-year-old child. It is a detail that defies easy comprehension, and it is preserved in the Spokane County Court record as a testament to the depth of cruelty that Mila was made to endure. Mila Rose Miller lost her life on September 10, 2022. But her ordeal did not end there, at least not in the sense of her story becoming known. After her death, Mandie Miller and Alexander Kramoyrov made a choice that speaks to a level of callousness that investigators found deeply significant. Rather than contacting authorities, rather than acknowledging what had happened, they kept Mila's remains inside the home, concealed inside a storage container, for approximately 3 months. For 3 months, they continued their lives while Mila remained hidden. In December of 2022, the couple loaded a U-Haul trailer and drove east. They drove across Washington state and into South Dakota. It was there, far from Airway Heights, far from Spokane County, far from the home where Mila had spent her last months, that law enforcement caught up with them. Mandie Miller and Alexander Kramoyrov were arrested in South Dakota. The investigation that followed was conducted across jurisdictions. Spokane County authorities worked with South Dakota law enforcement and federal agencies to build the full picture of what had happened, both during the months of abuse and in the 3 months of concealment that followed. The evidence was extensive. The court case that assembled from it was one of the most closely watched in Spokane County in years. Mandie Miller was sentenced in February of 2026, 3.5 years after Mila's death, to 32 years and 4 months in prison. The sentence was one of the longest delivered in a Washington state child abuse case in recent memory. It reflected the court's recognition of the duration of the harm, the severity of the physical conditions Mila had endured, and the calculated nature of the concealment that followed. Alexander Kramoyrov faced separate proceedings for his role in what had happened. 32 years and 4 months. For advocates and family members who had watched this case unfold, the sentence was a moment of bittersweet reckoning. It was accountability, real, substantial accountability. But it arrived after years in which Mila had needed something else: protection, intervention, an adult who would see what was happening and act. The child welfare system has examined the Mila Rose Miller case as part of a broader assessment of how abuse at this level can occur inside a home without triggering a protective response. Mila was 8 years old. She had been living in that home for a period of time before she lost her life. The question of who could have seen, who could have intervened, and what would have needed to happen differently. That question has no comfortable answer, but it is a necessary one to ask. Mila Rose Miller deserved safety. She deserved nourishment. She deserved to grow up in the home of a family member who honored the word family. She deserved all of it. The 32 years and 4 months sentence is a statement. And Mila's name, preserved in court records, in news archives, and in documentaries like this one, ensures that she is not reduced to a statistic. She was 8 years old. She mattered then. She matters now. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Sharing these stories is how we honor the children who can no longer speak for themselves. Case 7, Janet Garcia. March 27, 2024. Snohomish County Superior Court. The cases that haunt investigators most are often not the ones defined by a single inexplicable act. They are the ones defined by context, by everything that built up in the months and years before the worst moment, by the systems that were in place and the moments where intervention might have changed everything. The case of Janet Ernestina Garcia, which unfolded in Everett, Washington on March 27, 2024, is a case that communities across the Pacific Northwest have been grappling with ever since. It is the story of a 4-year-old boy named Ariel Garcia, and of how the systems that surrounded his short life failed to protect him when it mattered most. Ariel Garcia was 4 years old. 4 years old is perhaps the most vivid age of early childhood, old enough to have a real personality, to have favorite things, to be funny and stubborn and full of wonder in ways that make every person who encounters him remember him. 4-year-olds are present in a way that is almost overwhelming. They notice everything. They have opinions about everything. They are, in every sense, undeniably here. Ariel lived in circumstances defined by a custody conflict. His mother, 27-year-old Janet Ernestina Garcia, had been engaged in an ongoing dispute with Ariel's grandmother regarding custody and care arrangements. The details of that dispute, its history, its particular pressure points, the moments where it might have been resolved differently, became part of the investigative record that Snohomish County authorities assembled in the days and weeks following March 27, 2024. On that morning, inside an apartment in Everett, Ariel Garcia lost his life. The manner in which he was harmed was documented extensively in the Snohomish County court record. He was subjected to a level of violence. Investigators described up to 41 separate wound sites on his 4-year-old body. That speaks to a complete breakdown of every protective instinct that the bond between a parent and a child is supposed to contain. He was stabbed, repeatedly, inside the apartment where he lived. He was 4 years old. What happened next forms the part of this case that has been most difficult for investigators, prosecutors, and community members to fully absorb. Janet Garcia did not call for help. She did not seek medical assistance for her son. Instead, she wrapped Ariel's body in a blanket, placed it inside the trunk of her car, and drove south from Everett. She drove to the area near Joint Base Lewis McChord, JBLM, off Interstate 5, in Pierce County. She abandoned the bundle containing Ariel's remains over a fence line near the base perimeter. She then continued driving, south and west, eventually arriving at a rehabilitation facility in Ridgefield, Washington, where she checked herself in. It was at that rehabilitation facility that law enforcement located and arrested Janet Ernestina Garcia. She was taken into custody with physical evidence still present on her clothing, evidence that connected her directly to what had happened inside the Everett apartment. The investigation that followed was conducted across jurisdictions. Snohomish County, Pierce County, and Clark County all had roles in assembling the full picture of the case. Detectives from the Everett Police Department led the primary investigation. The evidentiary record was extensive, and the physical evidence was consistent and compelling. Janet Garcia was charged with serious felony counts in Snohomish County. The case moved through the legal process in the period that followed. In April of 2025, a court determination found Garcia competent to stand trial, an important procedural milestone that moved the case toward the accountability phase that Ariel's family had been waiting for. The case raised urgent questions about the custody conflict that had been ongoing in the months before March 27. Child welfare professionals and family court advocates have examined this case as part of a broader conversation about how custody disputes, when they become deeply adversarial, can create conditions of elevated risk for the children at their center. Ariel was the person most affected by the conflict around him, and Ariel had no ability to protect himself from where that conflict ultimately led. 4 years old, 41 wound sites, driven south and abandoned near a military base fence line. The facts of this case are hard to hold. They are meant to be held, because holding them is part of how communities process what has happened, identify what needs to change, and commit to doing better for the children who are still here. Ariel Garcia deserved to be fought for in a courtroom, not harmed in an apartment. He deserved to be the reason for intervention and protection, not the casualty that comes after intervention arrives too late. The legal proceedings in Snohomish County will deliver whatever accountability the evidence supports. And Ariel Garcia, 4 years old, full of personality and wonder and the particular vividness of that age, will not be forgotten. If this case has moved you, please like and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every case we cover here is a commitment to the children who deserved better. Case 8, Denaya Young. January 22, 2025. King County Superior Court. There are cases that arrive in a community and refuse to leave. Cases that sit in the collective consciousness for years after the headlines have moved on, not because they are mysterious, not because they are unsolved, but because the weight of what happened is simply too significant to be processed quickly. The case of Denaya Young, which unfolded inside a Central District apartment in Seattle, Washington on January 22, 2025, is one of those cases. It is the story of a 14-year-old boy named Ebony Young, and of a number that Seattle has not been able to forget. 1,172. That is the number of separate injuries documented by the King County Medical Examiner's Office on Ebony Young's body after his death. 1,172. It is a number that investigators, medical examiners, and prosecutors have all described as among the most staggering findings in Seattle's modern criminal history. It is a number that forces anyone who hears it to stop, to recalibrate, and to sit with the reality of what it represents. Ebony Young was 14 years old. He was living in the Central District, one of Seattle's oldest and most historically significant neighborhoods, a community with deep roots and a strong sense of identity. A neighborhood that has weathered decades of change and retained the particular character that comes from a community that knows who it is. Ebony was growing up in the middle of that neighborhood, at an age when everything is in motion: identity, friendships, the first real sense of who you want to become. He lived with his mother, 29-year-old Denaya Young. On January 22, 2025, Seattle Police Department officers were called to the Central District apartment where Denaya and Ebony Young lived. What they found inside that apartment initiated an investigation that would, over the following hours and days, assemble one of the most detailed and disturbing evidentiary records in recent Seattle history. Investigators determined that the events leading to Ebony's death had begun with a dispute over household chores. Specifically, and this is the detail that has been hardest for people to absorb, the dispute arose because Ebony had not completed kitchen chores to his mother's satisfaction. From that starting point, the confrontation escalated. Denaya Young, according to the investigative findings, physically assaulted her son in a manner that went far beyond any recognizable act of discipline. She shoved him against a wall. She strangled him. She struck him repeatedly with an extension cord. The assault continued with a duration and an intensity that the King County Medical Examiner's findings would ultimately quantify with devastating precision: 1,172 separate injuries. Ebony Young did not survive. The Seattle Police Department's investigation moved quickly once officers arrived at the scene. Denaya Young was taken into custody. The physical evidence inside the apartment was extensive and consistent with the findings of the medical examination. The charging documents filed by King County prosecutors described what investigators had found in terms that were careful, precise, and devastating in their totality. Denaya Young was charged with second-degree felony murder. The case was filed in King County Superior Court. The legal proceedings that followed drew significant community attention from civil rights advocates, from child welfare organizations, and from residents of the Central District who had known or encountered Ebony Young and who were struggling to make sense of what had happened. 1,172 injuries. The community response to Ebony Young's death was significant and immediate. Organizations in the Central District and across Seattle organized to mourn a teenager whose life had been cut short in the most preventable of ways. Vigils were held. Community leaders spoke. The conversation that erupted in the wake of Ebony's death touched on themes that Seattle has been grappling with in various forms for years: the adequacy of support services for families in crisis, the particular pressures on young Black families in a city undergoing rapid economic transformation, and the systems, school systems, social service systems, community support networks, that are supposed to catch children before they fall through every available net. None of those conversations diminish the accountability that Denaya Young faces. They exist alongside it, because accountability and systemic improvement are not competing responses to tragedy. They are both necessary, and they are both insufficient on their own. Ebony Young was 14 years old. He was at the beginning of what should have been a long and complicated and wonderful life. He deserved the chance to figure out who he was. He deserved to grow up in a neighborhood that was proud of him, to contribute to a community that would have been richer for his presence. He deserved to finish the dishes and go to bed. 1,172 injuries. That number is a record, a permanent record in the King County Court Archive, of what was done to a 14-year-old boy who should have been safe in his own home. The justice system is now responsible for delivering the accountability that Ebony Young's memory deserves. And this community, this city, carries the responsibility of asking, honestly and without defensiveness, what could have been different? What could have reached Ebony Young before January 22, 2025? If this story has stayed with you, please share it. Like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Ebony Young deserved better. Remembering him is the least we can do. Case 9, Jordan Shank. Late January 2025. Pierce County Superior Court. There is a category of case that child welfare professionals refer to as the most difficult to prosecute and the most preventable to prevent. Cases defined not by a single violent act, but by a slow, grinding failure of care that stretches across weeks or months until a child who needed everything has been given nothing. The case of Jordan Shank, which came to the attention of Pierce County authorities when charges were filed on January 30, 2025, is that kind of case. It is the story of a 5-year-old boy in Puyallup, Washington, a child whose name has not been publicly released by authorities out of respect for his family, and of the home he was found in on the day emergency responders arrived. He was 5 years old. 5-year-olds are built for the world in a particular way, curious, energetic, beginning to understand rules and consequences, beginning to develop the social skills that will carry them through childhood and beyond. They need food. They need warmth. They need a home environment that is safe enough to grow in, clean enough to be healthy in, stable enough to sleep in without fear. These are the minimum conditions. They are not aspirational. They are the floor. The home that emergency responders entered when they were called to a Puyallup address in late January of 2025 did not meet those minimum conditions in any dimension. There was no running water. In the Pacific Northwest winter, when temperatures in Pierce County drop to levels that require functioning heat, functioning plumbing, and properly maintained living conditions, this home had no running water. There was no heat. A 5-year-old child was living in an unheated home in a Pacific Northwest winter. The condition of the home beyond those basic failures was something that responding officers described in terms that reflected genuine shock. Used needles were present throughout the space. Active drug paraphernalia was accessible, not stored, not locked, not placed out of a child's reach, but present and reachable in a home where a 5-year-old was living. The child was found unresponsive. Forensic toxicology testing, conducted as part of the Pierce County investigation, confirmed what investigators had feared from the moment they entered that home. The 5-year-old boy had ingested a lethal dose of fentanyl. The substance had been present in the home, within the child's reach, and he had been exposed to it in a quantity that his small body could not survive. He was 5 years old. He had done nothing more than be a 5-year-old in a home where a 5-year-old should never have been left unsupervised and unprotected. Jordan Shank, 32 years old, was the child's mother. She was taken into custody by the Pierce County Sheriff's Office. On January 30, 2025, she was booked on charges of first-degree manslaughter and child abandonment, charges that reflect both the legal finding of gross criminal negligence and the court's assessment of the conditions in which the child had been left. The fentanyl crisis in Pierce County, and across Washington state more broadly, has been one of the defining public health emergencies of the past several years. Pierce County has consistently ranked among the hardest-hit counties in the state for fentanyl-related fatalities, and the crisis has not spared the youngest and most vulnerable members of affected households. Child welfare professionals who work in Pierce County have documented a sharp increase in the number of drug-endangered children encountered in home visits and emergency responses. Children living in conditions where the substances that are destroying the adults around them are left accessible to curious, trusting, completely unprotected little people who have no way of understanding the danger. The 5-year-old boy in Puyallup is part of that record now. He is one of the children who did not survive the environment they were placed in. Jordan Shank faces charges in Pierce County Superior Court that carry substantial penalties. The accountability process continues. In the broader community, the social service organizations, the law enforcement agencies, the public health responders who are fighting the fentanyl crisis on the ground in Pierce County, carries the weight of a case that represents, in the starkest possible terms, what is at stake when the systems meant to protect children fail to reach them in time. He was 5 years old. He deserved warmth. He deserved a home with running water and heat and food and the basic safety that every child deserves as a simple matter of being human. He deserved to wake up the next morning. The Pierce County legal system will speak on his behalf. And his story, the story of a child found unresponsive in a cold, unsafe home in January 2025, will not be forgotten here. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. These stories exist because these children existed, and because they deserve to be more than a statistic. Case 10. Alyssa Jade Vanderbeck. March 4, 2026. Pierce County Superior Court. There are cases that stop communities mid-sentence. Cases where the specific details, once heard, cannot be unheard. Not because they are the most violent in the record, but because they illuminate something about human nature that is almost impossible to integrate into a worldview built on the assumption that parents instinctively protect their children. The case of Alyssa Jade Vanderbeck and Mark Clammer, which became a Pierce County matter in March of 2026, is one of those cases. It is the story of a 7-week-old infant and of a TikTok video that became evidence. The infant was 7 weeks old. 7 weeks. At 7 weeks, a baby is still in the earliest days of life outside the womb, still adjusting to light, to sound, to the sensation of breathing air rather than floating. A 7-week-old is completely, utterly, entirely dependent on the adults in the room. There is no dimension of a 7-week-old's existence that does not require an adult to function properly. Every feeding, every moment of warmth, every instance of safety, all of it flows through the hands and choices of the people responsible for that child. Alyssa Jade Vanderbeck was 19 years old. Her husband, Mark Clammer, was 21. They were young parents in Lakewood, Washington, a community in Pierce County, adjacent to the city of Tacoma, with a newborn son who was 7 weeks old when everything changed. On March 4, 2026, Mark Clammer placed a call to emergency services. He reported that their infant son was not breathing. Emergency responders arrived at the Lakewood home and transported the infant to Mary Bridge Children's Hospital in Tacoma, one of the region's premier pediatric medical facilities, a hospital whose staff are trained for the most complex and critical cases involving children. The medical team at Mary Bridge Children's Hospital examined the 7-week-old infant carefully and thoroughly. What they found was documented in the medical record and subsequently became a central part of the Pierce County charging documents. The infant had sustained subdural hemorrhages, bleeding between the layers of the brain's protective covering. He had brain bleeds. He had retinal hemorrhages, bleeding inside the eyes, a finding that pediatric medical specialists have long identified as a marker of abusive head trauma from forceful shaking. He had experienced oxygen deprivation. The full constellation of his injuries was, in the language of the medical experts who examined him, completely consistent with a pattern of harm caused by a caregiver forcefully shaking an infant. He was 7 weeks old. The infant passed away on March 9, 2026, 5 days after arriving at Mary Bridge Children's Hospital. He was 7 weeks old when he died. Alyssa Jade Vanderbeck and Mark Clammer were both charged with second-degree murder in Pierce County. But the element of this case that caused the most immediate and widespread public response was not the medical findings, devastating as they were. It was what investigators discovered Alyssa Jade Vanderbeck had been doing while her infant son was dying in a hospital room. She had recorded a video of herself in the hospital bathroom, an upbeat, cheerful dance video, and posted it to her TikTok account. While her 7-week-old son lay in a pediatric intensive care unit, receiving the medical interventions that would ultimately prove insufficient to save his life, his mother was in the bathroom of the same hospital recording and sharing social media content. The video was preserved. It became part of the evidentiary record in Pierce County. It is, by any measure, one of the most disturbing single pieces of evidence in a recent Washington state criminal case, not because it depicts violence, but because of what it reveals about the disconnect between the gravity of what was happening in that hospital room and the apparent interior life of the person who bore primary responsibility for what had put the child there. Pierce County prosecutors charged both Vanderbeck and Clammer with second-degree murder. The case, filed in March of 2026, was among the most recent in this documentary's record at the time of production. Legal proceedings were ongoing. The medical community has been unequivocal in its assessment of this case. The findings at Mary Bridge Children's Hospital are consistent with a well-documented and extensively studied pattern of harm to infants, a form of harm that pediatric medical professionals have worked for decades to educate the public about, precisely because it is invisible from the outside and because the window of intervention, when an infant sustains these injuries, can be very narrow. 7 weeks old. Subdural hemorrhages, brain bleeds, retinal hemorrhages, oxygen deprivation. A TikTok video. Second-degree murder charges. The Pierce County legal system will be responsible for determining the full measure of accountability that this case demands. And the medical community, the child welfare community, and the broader public that has followed this case carry a responsibility of their own to take seriously the education and awareness campaigns around infant safety, to ensure that young parents have access to the support and information they need, and to remember that the most vulnerable people in any society are the ones who cannot yet speak. This infant was 7 weeks old. He had done nothing except exist, small and new and completely trusting in the world he had just arrived in. He deserved every protection. He deserved to grow. If this final case has moved you, if this full documentary has reinforced your commitment to fighting for children who cannot fight for themselves, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment telling us which case affected you most, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every case covered on this channel represents a child who deserved better, a family that was shattered, and a justice system that was asked to respond. We cover these stories not to sensationalize tragedy, but to honor the victims, to hold accountable those who caused harm, and to build the community awareness that child safety organizations tell us is one of the most powerful tools we have. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, 1-800-422-4453, is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If you are concerned about a child, please call. A single conversation can change a life. Thank you for watching Cold Case Hour. Like, comment, and subscribe. We will see you in the next documentary.